Alexander C. Albritton. Born in Florida, in 1892, Albritton grew up in a family whose parents had both been born into slavery. Over time, he worked his way north and built a career in professional baseball. He pitched for teams like the Baltimore Black Sox, Hilldale, and the Washington Potomacs. By 1925, his willingness to take the mound over and over had earned him a nickname, the Warhorse. Albritton pitched as many as 4 times a week. He spent years traveling across the country, facing some of the best black baseball players of his era. The money was never spectacular, but the game gave him a place in professional sports during a time when opportunities were limited. By the late 1930s, however, his life looked very different. Albritton was living in Pennsylvania when mental health problems led to his admission to Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. The facility already carried a terrible reputation. Thousands of patients lived inside buildings designed for far fewer people. Staff shortages were common. Reports describing conditions there filled newspapers. On January 31st, 1940, an attendant named Frank Wynand instructed Albritton to sweep a room. Exactly what happened next remains unclear, but at some point during the interaction, a confrontation broke out and Albritton struck Wynand with the broom, drawing blood. Wynand fought back. The attendant outweighed Albritton by around 70 pounds. With help from 2 other workers, he subdued the former pitcher. Doctors later claimed they examined Albritton and found no serious injuries. 3 days later, an attendant found him dead on a bench. The autopsy told a different story. Albritton had broken ribs, severe internal injuries, and a punctured lung. The lung injury caused his death. On February 3, 1940, Alexander Albritton died 9 days before his 48th birthday. Willowbrook State School. Thousands of children entered Willowbrook State School expecting care, but didn't realize they were about to end up in one of the biggest medical disasters in American history. The facility opened on Staten Island in the 1940s as a state institution for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. On paper, it offered treatment, housing, and supervision. But in reality, it quickly became overwhelmed. Willowbrook was built for around 4,000 residents. More than 6,000 eventually lived there. That kind of overcrowding turned everyday life into a health hazard. Children slept in packed wards, staff struggled to keep up, and hygiene collapsed under the weight of too many residents and not enough workers, and disease spread easily. One measles outbreak during the winter of 1960 and 1961 infected more than 600 children and killed at least 60. And that was not the only danger. Residents frequently lived among overflowing bathrooms, dirty clothing, and contaminated living spaces. Investigations later found children wandering through urine-soaked rooms while preventable illnesses moved through the facility almost unchecked. The death toll reflected those conditions. More than 100 children died in some years. Bronchial pneumonia claimed lives, choking incidents claimed lives, and infectious diseases moved through the institution with alarming speed. Then came the hepatitis epidemic. Doctors estimated that most children entering Willowbrook would contract hepatitis within their first year. The virus became so common that some staff jokingly referred to the institution as a hepatitis farm. And through this, researchers saw an opportunity. Beginning in the 1950s, doctors conducted studies on newly admitted children. Hundreds participated in experiments designed to study hepatitis and test potential vaccines. Some children received the virus intentionally, so researchers could observe how the disease developed. Critics argued that vulnerable children living in overcrowded conditions became subjects in experiments instead of recipients of proper care. As public attention grew, Willowbrook became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when science, neglect, and institutional power collided. In 1972, journalist Geraldo Rivera exposed the facility to the nation. His footage showed children living in shocking conditions and triggered widespread public outrage. 15 years later, Willowbrook was permanently closed. Oregon State Hospital. On November 18, 1942, dinner was served at Oregon State Hospital in Salem. At the time, the psychiatric facility housed around 2,700 patients, making it one of the largest mental hospitals in the state. Staff prepared a routine evening meal that included scrambled eggs. Nothing about the menu raised concern. Then, patients started collapsing. Within minutes, people were vomiting blood, suffering seizures, struggling to breathe, and falling into paralysis. Some died almost immediately. Others fought for hours before succumbing to the poison moving through their bodies. The scene quickly turned into a nightmare. Doctors rushed from ward to ward as patients filled hallways and treatment rooms. The hospital morgue reached capacity almost immediately. Before the night ended, bodies lined the chapel and surrounding corridors. Officials initially suspected sabotage. The United States was fully engaged in World War II, and fears of attacks on the food supply were widespread. Investigators from the Army, the Food and Drug Administration, and the American Medical Association arrived at the hospital looking for answers. The death toll kept rising. By the end of the disaster, 47 patients were dead and hundreds more were sick. Food samples were tested. Even rats were fed portions of the scrambled eggs. The animals died within minutes. 22 hours later, investigators identified the culprit: sodium fluoride. The same chemical commonly found in insecticides and roach poison had somehow made its way into the eggs. A tiny amount could kill a person. The answer came from inside the hospital kitchen. Earlier that day, an assistant cook had sent a psychiatric patient assigned to kitchen duty into a basement storeroom to retrieve powdered milk. The patient entered the wrong room, grabbed a container of roach poison, and brought it back to the kitchen. The powder was mixed directly into the scrambled eggs. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, hundreds of patients had already eaten dinner. Henry Cotton. In the early 1900s, Cotton was one of the most respected psychiatrists in America. He became the medical director of the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton and quickly built a reputation as a reformer. He removed mechanical restraints, expanded patient care, and embraced new medical research that many doctors considered groundbreaking. Then he became convinced he had discovered the cause of mental illness. Cotton believed schizophrenia, depression, and other psychiatric disorders came from hidden infections somewhere inside the body. The solution seemed simple: remove the infection. The victims were psychiatric patients who often had little power to refuse. At first, he focused on teeth. Hundreds of psychiatric patients had teeth pulled because Cotton believed bacteria were hiding inside them. When patients remained ill, he searched for new sources of infection. Tonsils came next, then sinuses. Soon, that search spread throughout the entire body. Colons, stomachs, spleens, gallbladders, ovaries, cervixes, and testicles all became targets. If an organ looked suspicious, it often came out. Cotton reported incredible success. He claimed cure rates as high as 85%. Newspapers praised him. Medical organizations invited him to lecture across the United States and Europe. Families traveled to Trenton hoping for miracle treatments. That said, surgery in the 1920s carried serious risks, especially before antibiotics existed. Infections would spread easily after operations, while many patients developed complications and while others died. Some patients understood exactly what was happening before anyone else did. Reports described psychiatric patients resisting surgery and fighting staff as they were taken into operating rooms. Their fear turned out to be completely justified. By the mid-1920s, independent investigators began reviewing Cotton's results. The numbers told a very different story. His cure rates collapsed under scrutiny. Researchers found no evidence that removing teeth or organs improved psychiatric illness. The mortality rate, however, was impossible to ignore. Some estimates placed it between 30 and 45%. Despite growing criticism, Cotton continued defending his methods for years. The surgeries finally faded after he left the hospital in 1930. 3 years later, Henry Cotton died from a heart attack. Regina Killen. Regina Killen entered a psychiatric hospital for treatment. The 64-year-old was a patient at Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, one of the state's largest mental health facilities. At the time, the hospital cared for hundreds of patients every day. The institution opened in 1931 and sat on hundreds of acres behind a perimeter fence. Over the decades, Marlboro became one of New Jersey's major psychiatric hospitals, housing adults with serious mental illnesses and operating with a budget worth tens of millions of dollars. Then, in November 1995, Regina Killen suffered injuries that would place the hospital under intense scrutiny. According to reports, Killen was on the floor when staff attempted to lift her. Something went terribly wrong. During the process, her head became wedged inside a wheelchair. The incident caused a fatal neck injury, and Killen died shortly afterward. The initial explanation sounded horrifying on its own. The autopsy made the situation even worse. Medical examiners found a broken neck. They also documented 3 broken vertebrae, 7 broken ribs, a spinal cord injury, extensive bruising, and hemorrhaging that extended from her chin down to her knees. Those findings immediately raised serious questions about exactly what happened during the encounter. A routine effort to move a patient somehow ended with injuries usually associated with severe physical trauma. The death drew attention to broader concerns surrounding conditions inside Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital. Critics had already questioned patient treatment and oversight at the facility. Killen's death became one of the incidents that intensified scrutiny of the institution during its final years. Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital. But Regina Killen was not the only patient whose death raised serious questions about conditions inside Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital. One woman disappeared from the facility and remained missing for nearly 48 hours before hospital staff realized she was gone. She was later found outside, frozen to death. Another patient suffered from a dangerous sodium deficiency. The condition had reportedly been documented in her medical records for 6 weeks, yet remained untreated. She eventually died from brain swelling. Perhaps the most disturbing case involved a man who spent roughly 80 hours restrained to a a bed over a 5-day period. Hospital policy required restraints to be loosened every 2 hours. According to reports, that did not happen. The patient later died from blood clots linked to prolonged immobilization. Years before those incidents, another case drew attention to the hospital. In 1946, a hospital attendant was charged after allegedly fracturing a patient's jaw in 2 places during an attack that reportedly occurred after he lost his temper. Within a few years, Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital closed permanently.